Hi everyone, I'm Claire Batkin from Your OT Tutor and welcome to my very first Your OT Tutor tutorial. The topic I'm covering today is NDIS report writing, and I'm going to be sharing 3 very practical tips that will hopefully help improve the quality of your report writing. So let's jump straight in. It's going to be a short, sharp, quick session. Before I get started though, I'd just like to perform an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Quandamooka people, who are the traditional custodians of the lands, winds and waters where I'm situated to provide this session today. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching this recording today. So, few objectives. What are you going to get out of this session if you stick through it and watch the full half hour? So hopefully you'll be able to learn 3 very practical tips for improving your NDIS report writing. So one is that you'll be able to provide clear descriptions of the person's level of function in a way that emphasises their support needs. Number 2 is that you'll present the findings of your standardised assessments effectively to support your recommendations. And number 3 is that you're able to draw on research evidence to strengthen your recommendations. So just a little bit about me for those that haven't come across me before. So I'm an occupational therapist. I've been an OT for about 16 years now. When it comes to my NDIS experience, I've been working in the NDIS for a few years now. And in terms of NDIS report writing, I've got experience doing independent assessments for NDIS participants that are going up against the NDIA in the AAT cases, or the ART as it's called now. I also have extensive experience as a clinical educator, so I'm hoping that in these sessions you'll be able to learn some really practical strategies so that you can change your practice and start to see some improvements straight away. Just a little disclaimer though, so this content is accurate at the time of recording, hopefully, which is December 2024. These tips that I'm about to share aren't NDIS endorsed, they're not secret tips that have come from the NDIA themselves, but they are some tips that are supported by many other experienced OTs that have been working in the NDIS for a long time. I'd always suggest with anything with NDIS report writing, no short tutorial or online course is going to teach you everything you need to know. It's very general information, so I would always recommend that you do some further professional development and ideally get some clinical supervision one-on-one to really discuss your client's specific cases and hopefully to apply some of this information that we'll cover today in a bit more of a specific way for you. Now, I'm going to get into those 3 practical strategies and tips very soon, but just one thing that you do need to know is that this little tutorial that I'm going to run isn't going to teach you everything you need to know about NDIS report writing. And what I actually teach when I'm teaching others how to do NDIS report writing is that it's actually a bit more of a 10-step process, with many of those steps actually starting before you even get to starting to write something into a report. And it's all about really being very focused in terms of the purpose of your report and the clinical reasoning behind the recommendations that you're going to make. And if you're not clear on those, then the report writing is going to be a lot trickier. So for those that are interested, I've got a full online course called the 10 Steps to NDIS Report Writing Success. I'll share some links in the comments so you can check that out if you'd like more information. But just in a nutshell, some of the key steps. So number 1 is that you need to determine the purpose of the report. So what exactly are you trying to achieve with the report that you're going to write and send to the NDIA in some form? Ideally focusing on what is that functional clinical outcome that's going to be achieved. Then you need to decide what type of report is needed, and the NDIA does have templates for some things and doesn't for others. You need to discuss your expectations with the referrer. So how long will this report take you? How much extra time will you need when you're not with the participant to work on this report so that everyone's on the same page with what's involved? Then you need to gather your evidence. So that could be things like standardised assessments, could also be interviews and observations. Once you've got all that information, then you need to check your reasoning and determine your recommendations. And this means looking against all the NDIS rules or regulations, which are always changing, and in particular, examining those reasonable and necessary criteria. So that's all the preparation section really of writing the report. The next 3 steps are when you're actually doing that report writing, and the tips that I'll share today probably fit into this section more than anything. Number 6 is to understand your audience. So know that you're writing for some sort of NDIS employee, and you need to know what sort of training or background do they have, and make sure that you're targeting the language so something that they can understand. 7 is really explaining your reasoning clearly and presenting that information in a really easy to read way, which is step 8 in that maximize clarity. Number 9 is once you've got all the report written, you need to review the report and incorporate feedback. And that can be feedback from the participant or their family or other stakeholders, or it could be from your supervisor as well or peers. Generally, having another set of eyes on your report is really valuable to make sure that the information that you're presenting is clear to somebody else. And then number 10, the final one, is you submit your report, but you're not done yet. So that's when you need to make sure you have a plan for following up the outcome of that report and also learning from that whole report writing process. Is there anything that you can do, updating your template or anything else you could change so that next time that report writing is even more quick and efficient? So, like I said, check out the course if you'd like more information about each of those steps. But right now, let's get launched straight into those 3 main tips. So the first one that we're going to talk about is writing very clear descriptions. So how can you highlight your client's support needs in a really clear way through the way that you're describing their function? So here's my 4 things that I think you should be including in your descriptions. So you need to describe how you got the information. So did you see the participant do something, or were you told it by the person themselves or by some of their carers maybe? The second thing you need to know is numbers. So vague terms like many, lots of times, numerous times, doesn't really paint a clear picture. So you want to give numbers such as timeframes, frequencies that things happen, meters that they can walk. All those sorts of things is going to really spell it out and remove any sort of subjectivity in the information that you're providing. Number 3 is to really be clear about what sort of assistance that they're getting. So it could be like verbal prompts, or it could be hands-on physical assistance. And if they're using any particular aids, make sure it's really clear what they're using. If it's for mobility, is it a walking aid or is it a walking frame? And then finally, also try and highlight the risks in your description. So if there's something that the participant's doing, maybe it's the way that the informal carers are assisting with transfers because there's no assistive technology available, then maybe you're going to highlight those manual handling risks and really spell that out and connect that to the description of your person's function when you're describing it. So there's 4 tips, but what does that actually look like in practice? So the whole idea of these tutorials is to give you some really practical tips that hopefully you can start to apply straight away. So let's jump into an example. So basically this is a really simple description of someone's mobility. So it says, Pam struggles to mobilize short distances in her home. She is slow and unsteady. So now if we think back to those 4 tips that I gave before, let's have a look and see if we can actually find those information in there. So number 1, do we know how you got the information? So you might be thinking there, it doesn't say that you observed her mobilizing, didn't say that Pam told you that she's struggling with her mobility. So that's a little bit unclear. And when it comes to writing these sorts of descriptions, if we actually see the participant do it, that's really valuable to include, because NDIS doesn't like approving recommendations when it's based just purely on our interview with the client. They want to know that we've seen it ourselves. And to be honest, we need to really see it ourselves for a lot of these activities so that we can make the right recommendation. Number 2, are there any numbers or specifics? So for example, we can see that they've written that she can mobilize short distances in her home, but what does short mean? So really we need to put some specific numbers or measurements in there to really clarify what we mean by short distances. The next thing on there was, do we cover what sort of assistance or aids are required? So we don't really know how she's mobilizing, other than that it's a bit of a struggle. So we don't know if she's mobilizing with somebody helping her. We don't know if she's using some sort of aid like a walking frame or a walking stick. So that's really important information that we need to include. And then finally, have we highlighted the risks? So it does say that she's slow and unsteady. So I suppose unsteady sort of implies a bit of a risk that she might fall, but sometimes you really just need to state the obvious and actually connect the dots for the reader and suggest that she was unsteady and that may lead to a fall. So if there's a few things missing there, how could we actually rewrite that to include all of those things to make it a little bit more specific? Here's the example for you. So what I've done is I've color-coded those 4 sort of elements that we want to see in our description. So it says, Pam was observed to mobilize 5 meters indoors using her walking stick before needing a 5-minute seated rest. She was noted to be unsteady, requiring standby assistance to prevent a fall. And Pam reported she's experienced 3 falls in the past month. First thing, before I go through the elements, you probably see, wow, that's a lot longer, seems a lot wordier. And sometimes I think clinicians are hesitant to write too many words because they've been told it needs to be short and sharp and efficient. The NDIA don't have time to read long reports. But the problem is, if we leave out this detail, if the NDIA plan is trying to allocate funding, they're just going to say, look, there's not enough information for me to see that Pam really needs this support. You haven't described it clearly enough. So as long as we're using more words, but those words are adding value, not just fluffy words with long-winded sentences, then I think it's still okay to do. And what you might find is that for every single activity that you're describing, you may not provide this much detail. If there's activities where you're not actually asking for supports for Pam, you may not need to go into quite as much detail. But if you're asking for specific supports or for a particular activity, then that's when you really need to give a really clear description. So if we go back to the elements, have we described how you got the information? So you can see we said that Pam was observed to mobilise, and then later on at the end we said that Pam reported she's experienced her falls. So we didn't see a fall, but we got that information from Pam. But it's very clear what we saw and what Pam told us. In terms of numbers, we've got the distance. So that short distance has now been clarified to 5 meters. We've also added that she needed a 5-minute seated rest. And in terms of her falls, we know that she's had 3 in the past month. So we've given that time frame and the frequency as well. In terms of assistance and aid, so we've added in now that she's using a walking stick, and we've also added that she needed that standby assistance to prevent a fall. And then finally, did we highlight the risks? That's the yellow part there. We said that she was unsteady, so that was the same as the first section. But what we've added in now highlighted that risk of the fall. We've really connected the dots to show that, yes, she's unsteady and that can lead to a fall. Hopefully that's given you a little bit more information about how to include all those details. And like I say, this is my opinion. You don't need to do it exactly my way if you disagree with any of my things, but this is just a suggestion for how I would write things. And this is coming more so from that medico-legal perspective in terms of what I know NDIA lawyers will be looking for or will be picking on when they're trying to dissect our reports and see if we've got enough evidence. So one final thing I just wanted to mention briefly before I move on to the next tip is when it comes down to impairment focus versus strength focused language, which is something that's talked about a lot. So unfortunately, impairment focused language isn't really nice, but it's important to use in terms of the NDIS and the way that sort of funding is allocated at the moment. So I'd like to say that the NDIS is a very strengths focused funding model, but in reality, that's often not the case. And sometimes if we highlight our participants' strengths too much, it can actually count against them in terms of the funding that's allocated. So I'll just give you a very quick example just to show you maybe how you can even just change the order of the information that you provide in a single sentence to really make it clear what the person's support needs are. So for example, we've got Jane can independently prepare a sandwich with verbal prompts once all items are prepared. So you might think, yep, that tells us a little bit about sort of her function. But what we need to be really clear of is even just the order of the sentence. So if I show you this way and highlight that first part, there's a risk that the NDIA, if we word it in this format, they may just see that first part. So they're just going to focus in on Jane can independently prepare a sandwich. And then there's that chance that they could disregard the other part that we put in about the fact that she needed verbal prompts once all items are prepared. And it also highlights something that I do see a lot when I do report reviews for other clinicians, is that sometimes we can be a little bit inconsistent. So we've even said here she can independently do it with verbal prompts. So if you're needing verbal prompts and all items prepared, that's not independent. So even though we want to be really strengths focused and focus on the fact that Jane is able to contribute to doing the task herself, then it gets very sort of inconsistent and unclear in terms of what her actual function is. And there is that risk that they'll just see the word independent and that's all they focus on. What we would maybe do to reword this in a different way is to put that assistance that she needs right at the start of the sentence. So we'll say Jane requires setup assistance and verbal prompts to prepare a sandwich. Now, you might be thinking, that's a lot shorter than the last example you just showed us, Claire. So obviously that's what the dots are. That's maybe just the first opening sentence, and then the follow-up sentences are where you would add in all that extra detail about whether you observed it or if it was reported, a little bit more detail about the type of assistance she's needing or the type of sandwich she's making, how often she's doing it, all that extra information. But I just wanted to highlight, really be clear about whether somebody's independent or needing assistance. And if they are needing assistance, that really needs to come at the start of your sentence. Okay, we're going to keep ploughing on and move on to the second tip, which is about how we're presenting the information from our standardized assessments. Now, in this short tutorial, I don't have time to really talk you through how to choose the right assessments. I'm going to assume that you've thought about and chosen a very good standardized assessment that's going to add value for your client. Now, if you're sitting there feeling a little bit lost, thinking, oh, I don't know how to do that, I do have some other online courses where I've covered this. So for OTs, I've got a big course called the OT Guide to Completing Functional Capacity Assessments, where I have a whole module on completing standardized assessments. And that's also been taken out and available as a standalone mini course as well. So you can check out that on my website. And also for OTs, there's the Your OT Tutor Alliance. I've done a workshop which is all about choosing and using standardized assessments generically across a range of different caseloads. So that could be helpful for you to check out, or just get in touch and I can give you some information about where you can find out more. But for this purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to assume that you've chosen a really good assessment. It's adding value to the information that you're trying to present. And now we just want to make sure that we're presenting the findings really clearly. So again, the short tips of what information should you include. So I've got the do include and the don't include. So you do want to make sure that you've clearly named the tool or the assessment that you're using. And if there's different versions, which version you've used, the date that you administered the assessment, who completed it. So whether it was something that was completed with the participant directly or with a proxy, like one of their carers. You might want to include a brief tool description, but you don't want to give an overly long-winded description of what the tool is and why it was made and all that sort of background. You want to deliver the key scores, and then you want to make sure that you've included the interpretation. And this is really important. You can't just dump the scores from an assessment into your report and hope that the NDIS will connect the dots with what this means for the person's function and how it relates to the recommendations you're making. So the interpretation is really important, and that's where you might include things like any risks that it highlights, any cutoff scores or norms, those sorts of things. And like I said, linking it back to the recommendations that you're making. Now, I've just got a very short don't include list. So top of the list there is don't include the full score sheet. Now, I do know that lots of OTs like to maybe do something like the HUDAS, and then they include the whole score sheet as an appendix. You can do that. There's nothing against doing that. But what I've heard from some other experienced OTs as well is that sometimes those individual scores in that score sheet can be taken out of context of the overall scores or your interpretation of it, and they'll just use that score as a reason to justify why a support isn't needed to be funded. So like I would say, always do the full score sheet, keep that filed away in the medical records that you keep, but I wouldn't necessarily attach the whole score sheet even in an appendix. I'd just be including a summary of the key scores in a table, which I'll show you a bit later. And then also I wouldn't include a very long description of the tool that's full of jargon and why it was developed and how it's used and all that information. You can include a brief description, which I'll show you an example of, but otherwise all that long-winded description is just making the report unnecessarily long and not really adding any value. So what I'll do, if you check out the comments, there will be a link to a handout that goes through some of the examples for this tip and the next tip in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to jump into my screen now and show you that one, and we're going to work through it that way. So I'm going to take you through an example using the HUDAS 2.0, which is a common assessment used for most NDIS participants. So this first part, I haven't critiqued it or edited it at all. So if you wanted to test yourself, it's a little bit of a way for you to go through and think about, is there anything I would do differently? So all this information at the start is just actually about the tool itself. It's not until you get to about this section here where we hear about Brian, who's the participant, and what his results were in the HUDAS. And then there's a table as well where they've included some of the scores. So if we look at that in a bit more detail, and you'll see that I've included a few comments to help you understand maybe some areas that could be improved. So for example, we've got here even just the American spelling of standardized. So if you've been tried to save at a time, put something into ChatGPT to say, summarize what the HUDAS 2.0 is all about, how it's used, then it could spit you out all this beautiful information, but even with the wrong spelling. So just be wary of that. But what I would suggest, there's lots of information, but how much of it is actually relevant and adding value versus just making the report unnecessarily long. So I would suggest that there's probably way too much detail, and particularly when it comes to the HUDAS, it is one of the tools that NDIA planners do know about. So you don't need to give very long-winded explanations about what the tool is. Even when it comes down to saying that it's available in multiple versions, really what you should be worrying about is which version did you use, because providing all these different information could actually just confuse the reader. Same with the scoring, you've got the different scoring options, but which one did you use? That's really all you need to be telling the person about. What I've got in blue here is that there's information that I probably would keep and include because it's really just summarizing some of the key points about the tool, so that higher scores indicate greater levels of disability and that it's widely used due to its reliability, validity, and adaptability across diverse conditions. So there's a little bit of information about the psychometric properties without going into long-winded detail about the validity and reliability and all that jargon that maybe the NDI plan is not really going to be able to understand anyway. When we get down to the results here, I mean, it's fine to include the information in written form, but just think about if you're actually just providing almost the same information in the table and in the written, consider whether you need to include both. And the table as well, there's lots of different scores, probably telling different things. So maybe just think about which of these columns is the NDIA planner going to be most interested in, and do I actually need the extra ones? Are they adding any extra value, or is this overall percentage really all I'm needing? So if I give you an example now of how it could be tightened up a little bit more. So what you can do is you can really just include the main key details about the tool itself and not go into a lot of detail. So what I've included that was missing before is I've really specified which version I use. So I use the 36 item version. And what was missing from that original very long-winded description was who I actually did it with and on what date. So I've said that I completed it with Brian on the 15th of December 2024 via an interview. There's lots of different ways. You could do it with a proxy, you could give it to him to fill in. So it makes a difference sometimes in terms of the results that you get. So you want to be really clear in terms of how you administered that assessment. And then I've got a little bit of a description in terms of that generic description of what the tool is, that it's just a generic assessment. It measures a person's self-perceived level of functional impairment, and that the higher scores mean a higher level of functional impairment. And then I've just given an overall score and I've made that bold so that hopefully it stands out a little bit more. And then you can see I've simplified that table that was way back up here with all the different columns. I've just included that one column and I've just split it to make it a little bit shorter. But all I've focused in on is the domain percentages and the overall percentage as well. And probably that's what the NDIA plan, if they don't have a lot of time to look at the scores in detail, that's what they're going to be most interested in. And I think probably earlier on as well, we've got here that a full version of Brian's HUDAS can be found in the Appendix 2.0. That's actually missing from my version because, like I said before, I wouldn't include a full version of the assessment in even an appendix, just for the reasons where it could sometimes be used out of context. And what I've added in, which was actually missing from that long-winded description in the previous example, was my interpretation. So I've given a summary in words that Brian scored at least a moderate level of disability across all domains, including extreme level of perceived functional impairment in the getting around and life activities domains. And what I've done then is compared, so how did these findings actually align with what I saw and what I've heard from other people as well? So these findings are in line with the occupational therapist observations and collateral history provided by Brian's wife, as Brian's fatigue and physical impairments impacting his mobility reduce his ability to mobilise freely both indoors and outdoors. He's also been unable to work in the past month due to an exacerbation of his MS symptoms, which has significantly impacted his functional capacity. So that's my sort of interpretation to show that I think that this standardised assessment is actually providing an accurate overview of Brian's function. And then what I've done is I've actually linked it back to his recommendations that I'll be making. So I've said that it's recommended Brian receive funding to explore assistive technology to assist with improving his mobility and support worker assistance to help with managing household tasks that were previously his responsibility. That's just a very short example. Obviously, if I was doing the assessment with Brian in real life, I may have more information that I'd like to link the scores of this to, but that's just a bit of a basic example to get you started. Now, what I would include up here, so when I've described the tool, I've just given 1 or 2 lines, but you may find that particularly if it's a tool that you've chosen, it's not really one of the NDIA preferred ones, but it's adding lots of value, you might want to actually describe the tool, but not necessarily put all that information in the body of your report because it can make it a little bit long. So what you might want to do is include that as a footnote or an end note. The footnote means it'll just go to the bottom of the page that you tagged it on. EndNote means it'll go to the very end of your report. So in the next example, I'm going to show you where I would use footnotes for referencing literature, but for providing information about tools, I generally put that at the end of the report as an EndNote, but no hard and fast rule that you have to do it that way. So if you're not really familiar with Word and that's what you're using to write your reports, how do you actually do that? So say, for example, it's what I've done here. I wanted to add the detail about the HUDAS itself. So if I go to the end of my report, it's already done it for me, but this is how I actually did it. So that's the information, the extra information I want to put about the HUDAS. I don't really want it in the body of my report, but I want it in the report somewhere. So say I want to put it at the start when I first introduce the HUDAS 2.0. I'll delete that now and just add it in. So what you do is you go to basically put your cursor where you want it to get added in, go up to references and just insert EndNote. And you can see it's basically jumped you down to the bottom of your report. If you've got the information highlighted somewhere else, or you can type it straight in, put that information in, and basically it's saved it. So then now, if the person wants to find out more about this new tool that you're using, they can hover over this and it'll bring up the information that you've added. So that's a way to include the detail, make sure it's in your report without actually making the body of your report too long. So that's how you could present information about standardized assessments. Okay, and now we're up to the final tip, which is all about research evidence, which I suppose has become a bit of a talking point in terms of should we be including research evidence to strengthen the recommendations that we're making in our NDIS reports. What's my opinion in a nutshell? Do we need to include it? I'd be saying if you're not using any sort of referencing at all in your reports, then maybe it is something to start considering, because with the recent legislation changes, there is a really big push towards making sure that the recommendations we're making are evidence-based and that we can prove that they're really effective and beneficial for the client. But also, if you're not routinely being aware of what the research evidence is, then you're not really being an evidence-based practitioner as well. So it's a good habit to get into, to start being a bit more aware of maybe some research evidence that's out there. Okay, so how do you actually find and use the research evidence? So there are a few steps for success, is what I would call them. So first of all, you need to be able to find your research evidence. Now, that's actually a whole tutorial in itself, to be able to do an effective database search to actually find valuable research evidence. So OTs out there, it was a workshop that I covered for my Your OT Tutor Alliance membership, or if it's something that maybe you think your whole team could do with a bit of a brush up on, I do offer some training sessions around that as well. Get in touch if you'd like more information about that. But again, in this example, I'm going to assume that you've found some good research evidence to support the recommendation that you're making. Once you've found it, then you need to copy the citation somehow, and you can sometimes get that from the database itself, or you can get it from the article or from the clinical practice guidelines. They might have a suggested citation, but basically that's just what is the reference that you're going to use. And there's not really any hard, fast rules that you must use APA format or Harvard format or anything like that. Just whatever you choose needs to be consistent. Then once you've got the citation, same as what I just showed you before with inserting sort of endnotes, you want to insert it as a footnote. You can actually reference the author by their last name, reference that in text APA style, and then have a reference list at the end. But again, it just depends how many references you're including and how long those references look in text. If it looks like it's cluttering up the body of your report and making it harder for somebody that's not really health trained to be able to skim read, then sometimes it is easier to insert them as a footnote, which means it'll come up at the bottom of that page that you've mentioned it on. And then hopefully, if you're starting to do this on a bit more regular basis, what you want to do is actually build a bank of go-to resources. So if you know you're regularly looking for information about pressure care injury resources, then you might want to, if you've come across some good articles that you know will probably be relevant to another client as well, then actually save that somewhere, save the citation somewhere, so that the whole process will be a whole lot quicker, and you can maybe skip the whole finding the research evidence, copying the citation, because you've got it somewhere stored and you can go straight to just including it into your report. So for this, you need to jump back to your handout, and I'll give you a bit of a demonstration as well of how you can do this. So this is just in the same handout. It's just a little paragraph about recommendation you're making for Ruth, who will need a pressure relieving air cushion. So you're wanting to maybe find some research evidence that's going to support the fact that air cushions are really beneficial for clients that are at a high risk of developing a pressure injury. So you've got the information about Ruth and the fact that you've assessed her using the Waterlow scale. You say that research evidence recommends people at high risk of a pressure injury require specialised assistive technology, such as a recommended pressure relieving air cushion, and you might have the specific model if you know what you're recommending, maybe in an AT application. And you could say specifically a systematic review of research evidence found that air cell cushions, such as a recommended model below, provide optimal pressure relief and shear reduction, and are therefore likely to be effective and beneficial for allowing Ruth to maintain her current functional capacity. And then you could also put in the information that it's been trialled extensively as per the details below. Like I say, I'm just focusing on how to include research evidence, but in terms of the evidence for how something is effective and beneficial, remember that also comes from trials that you've done or from the participants' past experience using things like the AT, or even your experience using AT with other clients with similar presentations. So include that as well as your evidence, but for when there is research evidence available, maybe it may not be for all the things that you're looking for, but if it is available, this is how you want to include it. So basically we know maybe that there's some systematic reviews out there, and we're just trying to think, where do we read it? What is it? Say you've come across it in PubMed. I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of then how you can get the citation from PubMed and include it in your report. You shouldn't have to necessarily go to an APA formatting guide or referencing guide and type it in manually yourself. There are different ways that you can get the citation easily. So for example, PubMed is one of those ways that you can do it. So this was a systematic review that I found about the effectiveness of pressure relieving cushions. Again, you don't just pull any article because it seems to have the right keywords in the title, or you read the abstract. You need to actually make sure that the articles that you're referencing are relevant to your client, that you've actually read through. Again, that's information that I cover in my membership, or you can ask me for more information about how to develop those skills as well. Or if you're looking at just becoming more familiar with using research evidence, I do run a journal clubs as well, which is online for occupational therapists, where you can just get familiar with reading and finding research evidence. Okay, this is the one that we need. If we click on it here in PubMed, you can see on the side here, it'll bring up this option to cite. And then what you can do is you can actually change the format. So APA is one that OT is often used at uni. There might be different versions. Not really sure exactly what all those things stand for. So we'll leave it with this for now. We can just click copy, and basically that should have copied that citation. If we go back to our report, okay, we're thinking, yeah, where do I want to include this? Let's say we're going to do at the end of the systematic review, or we might have just put at the end of this sentence, research evidence recommends people at high risk of pressure injury require specialized assistive technology. We'll put it there for now. So you put your cursor where you want to add it, and you go into your references tab again. And then this time, instead of putting it right at the end of the report, I'd probably put it at least on the same page as where you're wanting to insert it. So it's very easy for the planner to be able to skim down to the bottom of the page and see what article are you referencing. So we're just going to go insert footnote, which is the bigger one here on the side. And it will take you to the bottom of the page. From PubMed, I've still got that on my clipboard, so I can just go Control Paste, and it's brought it up there for you. So that's one way you can do it. Sometimes that's DOI. If it's hyperlinked, it should take them directly to the article as well. If you don't have the DOI, including the link of where you found the resource, hopefully it's a peer-reviewed sort of strong evidence, not something you've just Googled on Wikipedia, then yeah, it should be easy for them to find the actual article as well. So hopefully that's made it a little bit less scary. Like I say, if the scary part is actually finding the research evidence, then get in touch and I can give you some more information about where you can learn that skill. Okay, so that's nearly the end of this tutorial. Hopefully you'll be able to think back and go, yep, there's at least one thing that I can start doing differently that's going to help me improve my report writing. So always stop and think about that and set yourself the goal of changing even just one small thing. If you're quite overwhelmed thinking there's so many things I want to start doing differently, that's great. I'm glad it was helpful. Don't set the bar too high. Start with at least one small thing so that's achievable, and then move on to the next thing. Now, if you did find this tutorial session helpful and you want to find some more of my resources, then go to my website and have a look. So I do have the Your OT Tutor Learning Library. Depending on when you're watching this recording, it's either a few days away from being launched in its new form, or it's already available, but there'll be more information about that. Basically, it'll just be one place where you can log in and access all my free downloadable resources, some webinar recordings, and any future Your OT Tutor tutorials as well. Lots of different topics that you can jump on and see. You're probably watching this on YouTube as well, so you can view lots of other different short videos and some longer webinars on my YouTube channel as well. So make sure you subscribe there and you'll be able to see any new videos as they're added. Now, if you do have any questions, you're welcome to get in touch with me via my website or my email. I'll share my details on the next slide. Very happy to answer any questions that you might have or to point you in the direction of some other further training that might be helpful for you. So the easiest way to find me is via my email address, or there's a contact form on my website that you can reach me through. Or if you're just interested to see what other sorts of education I provide, so most of it is OT specific, but I do also have some training and resources that are open to any allied health health clinician. So if you think it's useful for you, you're welcome to check it out and have a look. If in doubt, please just get in touch and I can give you information about what's included in the course or the resource so that you're fully informed before you sign up. But thanks for sticking through to the end. Hope it was helpful, and I'll hopefully see you at the next Your OT Tutor tutorial. See you next time.